With that, I would like to introduce our first speakers, Jan Runge and David Hancock, and they're going to give us an overview of the market. Thank you. Gentlemen.
You there, please. Hello, everyone.
You can answer, you know.
It's really, really nice to be here. And first of all, I'd like to thank Nick Dager and also ISE and Jörg Seiler and the team for putting this together. It's great to see so many familiar faces in the room. And I'm going to introduce the main person on stage in a moment. But before that, I want to say a few words about the ICTA, who are also sponsors and partners of the event. So, International Cinema Technology Association, we have around 320 members across the world, cinema technology manufacturers, service providers, who celebrate and promote investments in innovation in cinema. We have a very active branch here in Europe. Thomas Rüttgers is back there. He's member of the board. Till Kussmann is here. And we engage and participate in events like this across Europe. And with that said, I'd like to welcome David. David Hancock is the research director cinema for what is now called Informatech.
Correct.
And the president of the European Digital Cinema Forum. Do you want to introduce yourself a little and your organization?
Well, I'll just briefly go on the Informa side. So about 6 months ago, IHS Markit sort of swapped us, so the technology side of the business, into a company called Informa. So I'm now yet another incarnation of my being. I'm now David Hancock of Informatech. So it's been Screen Digest, IHS, Screen Digest, IHS Markit, and now Informatech. So that's all you need to know, really. And EDCF is the European Digital Cinema Forum. So that's a sort of impartial, neutral space to talk and discuss and to provide information to the market that we do. And I'm the president of that for the past few years.
And David is obviously a well of information and knowledge about cinema. So rather than doing a keynote here, I thought I would invite somebody who knows a lot more about cinema on stage and interview him. So David will do all the heavy lifting, and I'll crack some jokes on the side.
And he gets his name on it.
So just to explain the format, we'll go through a presentation and have a conversation. And to begin with, we thought we would independently of each other come up with a statement that defines or that captures our view of the state of cinema at the moment. And this is mine, and this is of course backed on the fact that I think global box office for the first time reached more than 42 million US dollars, so very strong global industry. And also in Europe, France, the UK, other territories had almost record numbers of box office again in 2019.
Correct.
And this is David's statement.
Which is much better, clearly. That is mine, yes. And how do you know it's mine?
I think it's just a lot more nuanced and a bit researchy.
Bit researchy. That's probably me then, isn't it? See, well, I'd probably agree with yours as well, but I also wouldn't say it's here to stay because you can't guarantee that. And in my business, people tend to remember what you said. And if you get it wrong, they come back to you and say, you got that bit wrong. So I wouldn't say it's here to stay, but I do think it's here to stay. I just can't say it. And the difference is, I think the concept, the idea of justifying your existence is where we differ slightly, probably. I just think that every so often, everything's the same, actually, not just cinema. You need to sort of present yourself again. You need to reconnect with an audience and say, look, this is who we are, this is cinema. We still have a place in the market. We still have a place in your hearts and your daily life or your monthly life or whatever it is. So it just sometimes needs to think in a way of reconversion, if you like, reconnecting with its audiences. And it's happened at various points throughout cinema's history. And because it's such a long, established medium, I think this is one of those points now that has to sort of say, look, we're still here, guys, and people know they're here. But at the same time, the average person, on average, goes to the cinema 3 times a year. In most countries, it's around about 3. and that pretty much equates to about 8 hours of your life. So you're not talking about something that people do every day or every week mostly. It's something that they do 3-4 times a year. So it's a way to keep them in their keep you in their minds. And that's sort of what I think I'm saying.
So you can probably tell now who was a lobbyist before and who has a long background in research.
Yes.
So I took a look at a few headlines about our industry in recent months, and if you look at the news, it seems as if the cinema industry is hanging on the edge of a cliff called streaming, and you kind of wonder whether that is the case. Cinema versus streaming, also something that people will not the next, but a following panel will discuss. The battle over when and where can we see movies. It's all a bit sensationalist, so what does the reality look like?
Reality is, the reality is that, you just put it up. The reality is, overall, filmed entertainment, which includes the stuff on TV as well, is that it's a growing area, really. So, but the reality is also, the previous quotes, you could have taken them 30 years ago, you could have taken them 40 years ago with VHS and DVD and Blu-ray. They come around all the time, and essentially journalists have a job to do, which is to try and get people to click on your website or read your paper. And that's one of the ways you can do it. You take an angle. But underlying all that, and fundamental to all that, is more content, more people watching content. And actually, if you look at that slide there, you can sort of see quite clearly the green bar at the bottom. I'm probably in the way of most of you, but the green bar at the bottom is going down. So transactional home media is going down. We all know that. Being taken up by digital subscription, which is basically streaming. But also pay TV, remarkably stable. People tend not to be getting rid of their pay TV subscriber, if you like. They're adding things on top of that. But the bit that interests me, obviously, is the cinema part, and this is the European slide. So it's relatively stable. So underpinning all the changes happening in people's consumption of media is a very stable cinema sector that actually is meant for people like studios. They can have a certain amount of confidence in revenue and maximization of revenue based on the fact that their cinema has been remarkably stable and constant.
Okay. And this now the next slide looks into cinema itself.
Yes. So that's broadly a twin track. So I find that when I talk to people about cinema, and like a lot of people in this room, we go around the world talking about cinema and meeting new people, which is great. And people tend to have a view of cinema based on where they live. So if you live in Western Europe or particular markets in Western Europe, you'll have a fairly negative view of cinema because it's possibly in decline in some countries. If you live in a country in Asia that has a new cinema sector which has been totally refreshed, then you'll have a pretty positive view of cinema. It's a new medium, new things are happening. So your perception of cinema is largely linked to what your own cinema experience is. The reality of that, though, is that Western Europe, the standard mature markets, so Western Europe, North America, Japan, Australia, they're mature. So that basically says it all. They're not going up or down vastly, except in a couple of exceptional cases. But that's one track. So maturity is one track of the cinema world. But as we saw last year, you can have a very good year like France, like the UK. You can have very good years without maturity. The other track, which is actually 2/3 of the cinema world as we speak now, is growth and refreshment of existing cinema estates. So old cinema environments, whereas most people in this room started multiplexing 25, 30 years ago. Some countries around the world are either just starting with cinema completely, like Saudi Arabia, or are replacing very old cinema infrastructures now, in the past 5 years, with new cinema. So it is actually a new growth phase for them. So you look at a graph of 20 years ago in the UK, you can probably now equate that graph to what's happening in Southeast Asia. So you can sort of, from my point of view, you can look around and think, well, the next 5-10 years of cinema should be growth, given all the new countries that are coming on stream.
What's interesting to me is that if you, this is from 2013 to 18, which even saw growth in Western Europe, and 2018 wasn't even such a strong year.
No, it wasn't, and it's, as you see, 0.5% up over that's an average over the 5-year period.
Yeah.
So, broadly, it's across all of Europe, it's fairly static, but it's not broadly in decline.
let's focus a little bit on Europe. I organized an event in Germany 1 month ago, where we did a tour with cinema operators across different cinemas, and it was just really interesting that many of the issues, the new trends, or the developments that were discussed did actually come out of the UK. So the UK seems to be a place that cinema operators and others in the industry look towards too, in order to understand how the industry can evolve.
Yeah, it's not something I'd really focused on until you pointed it out to me, actually. But it is true that the UK seems to be doing things like the boutique cinema, like some of the technology that is kind of could be a trend. Maybe we just like spending money in the UK. That could be it. We just like going out, getting out of our houses. But what I have noticed, out of all the countries we track, 61, 62 countries in detail, that is, we track all the world, but 62 countries in detail, when a country starts to multiplex, sites go down, screens go up, because obviously you're taking out 1 screen, 2 screeners, and you're building new cinemas with 5 to 10 screens. That happens every country. And 4 or 5 years ago in the UK, sites started to go up. Now, obviously, the first year you think just a blip, fine, just one-off, but it's been happening every year for 5 years now. So this is the only country I can really see this happening in. And when you look into it, you're seeing that. So Odeon, Cineworld, people like that are building new cinemas, but you also have Everyman, which has doubled in size in the past 5-6 years and projected to double in size again in the next 5 years. Picture House as well, the Light, a cinema chain that's building cinemas. So you have what can only be described as a very confident sector with people investing with confidence in that sector, and it's not really happening elsewhere. And what I've sort of, if you drill into them, it's sort of because there's a demographic stratification and an experience stratification. So you're providing different experiences at different levels of cinema for different people. So on the demographic side, you're trying to aim at different pots of people in a way that you couldn't in the past. And on the experience side, you're providing different experiences in the way that you couldn't in the past, whether that's technology-based or luxury-based or dining-based or whatever, based on something or other that's different to what happened. You can stratify far more now in cinema than you could before. You could probably also argue, I don't have the economics behind this to justify it, but I think you can also argue that the risk profile of cinemas has decreased because they're probably cheaper to run now. So you can probably put a cinema in a town that couldn't afford one before because there are probably less staff in the cinema and things just operate differently. An exhibitor would probably have to tell me if that's an accurate statement or not, but certainly people seem to be building cinemas in towns that didn't have them before.
Okay. Be interesting to understand if the big 3, which obviously also run theaters all across Europe, do this as a starting point towards something that will also happen more and more in other countries, or not? Whether it's
and that's what I'm looking at really. Is this the start of a trend, or is it just the UK being totally on its own? When I look around Europe, it does seem to me that there's a sort of view. I have some Scandinavian friends, there's a few in the audience here, and when you sort of talk to them, quite often they say, well, cinema is a democratic experience, we wouldn't want VIP cinema, we just want the same experience. I'm not sure how true that is, it's just the people I know in Scandinavia, possibly. But if it's a democratic experience where it has to be the same for everyone, then obviously that sort of stuff's not going to work. But the UK clearly has a different view of that, in which you want different experiences.
Okay. We'll switch to a totally different topic.
Okay.
And I will let the next
Not too different,
clip...
It's still cinema, yeah?
Oh, it's still cinema.
Good.
I'll let the next clip speak for itself, but it's worth noting the expression on Jane Fonda's face when she announces the winner.
And the Oscar goes to Parasite.
Parasite, a dark comedy, was the night's historic big Oscar winner as the first foreign language film to do so, with 4 Oscars, including Best Picture, Best Director, Best International Film, and Best Original Screenplay.
We never imagined this to ever happen.
Well, unfortunately, there was something not in sync, but
we got the picture.
I guess Hollywood was also surprised. I guess that's what I wanted to say. And I included this because we now focus on content. Parasite is wonderful, funny, very violent, worth watching. And I'm using it as an intro because 5 years ago, I remember, there were lots of commentators who wrote that, with the quick rise of cinemas in Asia, we will eventually see a lot of Asian films on screens in Europe or also in the US. And I'm just wondering if that's the case.
Well, can you see them?
No.
So I wasn't one of those commentators. I'll just let you know. I didn't think that was going to happen. So there was an exchange, especially China, Hollywood. There was a lot of talk about investing in Hollywood companies investing in China and vice versa. It is true that in 3 or 4 years' time, 45% of the world's box office will be generated in Asia, and that is pretty much a fact now, not let alone in 5 years' time, 4 years' time. So you could argue then that that's going to have some effect on the types of films, the types of things that we put into cinemas. I've never thought, and I never do think, that it's going to mean Chinese films all over the world, or in this case Korean films, or even any foreign language films, because that's not how it works. So there are always exceptions to this. And when Wanda bought into Legendary, for example, the idea was not to make Chinese films through Legendary, it's to try and make Hollywood films, just try and keep going with Hollywood films, but have maybe more Chinese input into them, or Asian input into them, and to do things slightly differently, but also to learn the other way around. So they're learning from the studios about how to make films for their own domestic audiences. So I don't think that that's the case. I don't think it's going to start up a whole trend of foreign language film. I watch a fair few foreign language films anyway. I like them, and some people do. And tends to be the people that like them and know them will watch them anyway, frankly, and the ones that don't won't. So I think that, broadly speaking, the studios have their own model, and the previous slide shows, that at a certain point in time, about 5-6 years ago, their market share was declining in the USA, down to less than 70%. For them, that's a big deal. It also means that their share declines across the world because they rely on sort of 50 to 100 films. They make 100 films, but probably about 50 of those films are generating and driving box office. So if they're declining market share, then obviously their whole global market's decline as well. They've pushed that back up again, back up to the 80s again. One company especially, actually, so Disney, look at Disney, $42 billion box office last year, 2/3 studios, so 2/3 is generated by Hollywood, so that's about $28 billion. Of that, Disney took $12.5 billion. So Disney's actually about 30% now of global box office is generated by one company. But the way they're doing it, and the way they have done it, and it's not just Disney that's doing it, but they are the predominant exponent of it, is through franchise films. And franchise films, by that I mean the Marvel stuff, the DC, but also the sequel stuff, Fast and Furious, those sorts of things, which have always been in our heads as important. But you look at the stats there. 5 years ago, they were making up 20 films, so that's 2/5 of the films, and the top 50. Sorry, this is the top 50 films. 20 of them were franchise films, making about half the box office. You look at last year, 28 of them were franchise films, making up over 2/3 of the box office, nearly three-quarters of the box office. So 28 films are taking about 80% of 80%, because the top 50 say 80%. So those 28 films really are driving box office. Now, going back to the Chinese point and the foreign language film point, the reason I think these films are doing well is because they're simple. They're quite simple to market and to put across as ideas. They're not complicated. You can sell it around the world. Woman in green fights guy in red. That's pretty simple. Even I can get that. And a lot of them are I like that. You're putting things which are not lowest common denominator, because they're also very good films with good scripts. But the ideas are quite easy to convey and to market. And I think we're going to see more of them. Not necessarily more Marvel, but more of films like that, as the box office becomes more and more global. Bear in mind that there are now, we track, I think there's 198 countries that we have cinemas in our database. That's a lot that's all the countries in the world, basically. So cinema is starting everywhere. And we always thought it was global, but actually it wasn't always global. It wasn't everywhere. Now it is.
So I put together one figure to basically comment on that, and I wonder whether you know what that figure might stand for. Any guesses are welcome. So, no one? Okay.
Anyone know? No.
That's the number of feature films produced in Europe in 2 years ago. I couldn't find more recent figures.
There aren't more recent.
And so it's staggering. It's a staggering amount of films produced in Europe. And this is the number of theatrical releases in a selected...
Can I put that number in context?
Yes,
so
please.
There are 8,000 films produced in the world every year, just over 8,000 every year. and so that's about a quarter of the feature films in the world are made in Europe. India has another quarter. India has 2,000 on its own. So that basically means between India and Europe, that's half the world's film production.
And so this slide, by the way, is from Guillaume from Unique. So thank you for letting me use this. And I guess I will let you do the interpretation, but it begs the question whether the right films are being created and whether we are capturing enough audiences. We'll make another switch now to another topic.
Sure.
Because after all, this is ISE, and we're talking about cinema technology.
We are.
So why don't you run with the next 3 slides and explain how the experience, but also the technology has changed?
Sure. Well, that's just the standard slide. It's not updated to 2019 yet because we don't have all the 2019 data. But broadly, that slide is a sort of a resume, if you like, of around the world, various little bits of data and trends. But the trend about technology really is that technology is one of the core components now of cinemas. There are other ones as well, so we put up there, what have I got? I can't read that one. Technology, experiential, seating, boutique, design and service. And in service we include actually dining as well, things like that. So there are various elements cinemas can use to make themselves stand out, to differentiate themselves, technology being one of those components. So you see things like immersive audio. So I think that's now over 7,000 screens worldwide is immersive audio. Bear in mind that I think I've worked out that March the 5th will exceed 200,000 screens in the world. I know that's quite specific, but it's just a linear progression from where we are. But broadly, we're about 200,000 screens in the world as of now. So 7,000 is not that many, I guess you can argue, 3.5%. But it's also, that's quite a high level of audio. PLF, I think we've reached now 4,000 PLF screens around the world. IMAX is the biggest sort of brand within that, but we are starting to see other brands as well. 4D, the really experiential stuff. So 3D started off. 3D is still on 54% of screens in the world are 3D equipped. Revenue-wise, it's going down. But 4D and motion seating, I should say, is on 2,000 plus screens. So what was actually a fairly slow start for 4D, and I think quite a lot of skepticism, including myself. So I got the previous one right, I got that one wrong. But the people are using 4D and seeing it works for a certain audience. I'd sort of venture to guess that not this audience in this room, but if you're sort of between 12 and 20 or 12 and 19, 4D is proving actually quite popular. So these are technologies. It's a fundamental part now of the cinema offer.
We'll need to speed up a little.
Sure.
So we have 2 minutes left.
Sure.
Really briefly?
Same thing. The main point of that, global brands are becoming more important in that PLF world. So cinema exhibitors did their own brands and still do. There are 120 cinema brands of PLF around the world, but the global branded stuff, which could Dolby Cinema, Realty's Ultimate Screen, things like that, are starting to actually gain traction as well.
And this is
different markets, different penetration rates, different acceptance of these things. I would argue that new markets, developing markets, are more accepting of new technologies and new ideas than established markets.
So if PLFs in Europe, capture around 2% of screen share, how much do they actually earn in terms of box office?
8 to 10% probably. It's usually about 3 or 4 times.
Okay.
And I'd sort of argue actually that you're starting to see a premium window happening, which is the first 2 weeks of a film's release goes onto the premium screens, and that first 2 weeks is capturing more and more and more of that money and the revenue because of this sort of de facto premium window. It's not an actual window, but it sort of is.
And do the studios back all these different formats?
They don't not back them, really. They will let them exist. I think that generally if you ask the studios, they'll say loads of formats means more complication for them, the mastering levels and all that sort of stuff. But they're not actively sort of trying to dissuade them from doing it. But in terms of backing, you have to sort of understand as well that someone at some point has to master these things, has to put them on a screen. And the best way to get something on a screen is to make it look like you want it to look like. So if you are one of these people doing this, then mastering your own content for your screen is probably the best way to do it. And I think that generally the studios won't sort of go away and master it to your requirements. They'll just say, you have to do that yourself.
We're going to whiz through this now. So 1 sentence per screen. That's my local cinema in my hometown, and I don't have more to say about it.
Okay. Is that good? Technology. Well, that's just basically a slide that's showing that because of the replacement. Digital projection made things more complex. There are a lot of different options now in terms of putting projection in, or even not projection, displays. But that slide shows you in certain countries, different countries have had different attitudes to replacing, different attitudes to the length of technology. So Austria there, obviously Cineplex now has a deal with Cineonic and Cinema Next to put all laser in. So, but they kept their Series 1s running as long as they could until they had that deal, which the economics made sense to put it in. So it just sort of gives you an idea that, of around the place that people are starting to judge and to gauge what is the right timing for them to replace their projection.
Mm-hmm. Let's actually, unfortunately, jump the next one, if that's okay. About
skip that.
And end with a comment on, will Netflix kill the movie theater?
I know there's a panel on this later, streaming and cinema, so I won't go into too much detail. Obviously, they discuss it in their own way. But my point on this really is very simple, that Netflix is not the enemy, It's doing certain things, so it has different impacts on cinema, production finance, actors and directors moving over to the streaming areas. That's all true. Their views on windows, they're trying to sort of deconstruct the window to a certain extent. But at the same time, you look at that, consumers of Netflix are also people who go to the cinema. And consumers of Amazon go to the cinema more than those that don't. So you could probably argue that the enemies of cinema are the ones that don't use Netflix, not the ones that do use Netflix. These people that are watching streaming are also the people that go to the cinema. It's the same with gaming, it was the same with DVD. It's a symbiotic relationship. It drives each other. And we mustn't get into our mind that at a consumer level, Netflix and cinema are two disassociated things. They're not. They're the same people, and they like watching content in different formats, different places.
Okay. And there will be loads of cinema operators and other industry professionals commenting on this later on. So to be honest, I think we need to cut it off there. I'd like to thank you for your time and for bringing all those insights to kick off the conference. Thanks very much for listening.